Hi, my name is Ashish Gadnis. I'm one of the co-founders of BanQu, and BanQu is a for-profit, for-purpose software as a service company that enables traceability, transparency, and more importantly, equity in supply chain so that the poorest farmers and the poorest recyclers in the world can now break the cycle of extreme poverty. Why I joined the Refugee Migrant Network was, I think, three reasons. One is, first of all, I grew up poor and was very fortunate to get out of poverty, out of India. And I came to the United States, helped build a couple of startups. And so I've always had this, grounding around extreme poverty. And refugees are forced into poverty, even if they didn't start poor. So that was kind of one reason where I felt that my ethics or ethos was tied to that. Second is that, at least in my understanding, the RMI is a community of like-minded people who don't look at refugees as numbers, but really look at talent and what can that talent do for the bigger community. And then the third one was really the opportunity for businesses or companies like us who are for-profit companies, but also driven by purpose. So those three things kind of, came together very quickly when I first heard about RMI 3 years ago, and I was like, sign me up. So there's a lot of competitors who say, hey, we use blockchain to tell you where your coffee came from, or we use blockchain to tell you where your tuna came from, right? Or your diamonds came from. And I ask a simple question. If that is true, can that fisherman on the South China Sea tell you that, yes, I sold the tuna that you're now picking up at your grocery store and I got paid, and I can prove it? Or this diamond that you're staring at that says it's not a blood diamond, can you prove that that child is not being held in a mine as child labor? If the answer is no, then don't say you're using blockchain to create equity, right? That's where there's a lot of competitors, but at any given time, we're 10 years ahead of anybody else, A, because we have patent approved and all that kind of stuff, but B, we truly believe that last mile worker, refugee, miner, recycler has four words, which is the ability to own their data, access their data, monetize their data, and permission their data. Mm-hmm. And if you say you can't do that, then you shouldn't be in the business of creating traceability, transparency in a way that empowers refugees out of the situation they are, or people in poverty out of the situation they are. Look, every global brand, right, wants to have a profitable supply chain, correct? And they want to be ethical, right? Mm-hmm. And what we have proven that you can do both, mm-hmm. right? You don't have to get shoved into a CSR bucket and say, hey, we opened a school. I'm like, well, if you opened a school, then are the children in school, right? Mm-hmm. And have you created economic empowerment so that you can prove to your customer, yes, we have an ethical supply chain, and yes, we can prove it, right? Not just saying it's fair trade. Absolutely. So, a lot of people ask this question, why is BanQu relevant to education or refugees or migrant workers, right? And a lot of people think about BanQu as, traceability, transparency for farmers. But if you look at our growth, or especially the last 12 months, right now we're live in 41 countries and 600,000 people in the last mile, first mile. And the way we define last mile, first mile is refugees, waste pickers, people who are displaced, recyclers, smallholder farmers, COVID-19 workers. And if you look at that last mile, first mile, bottom of the pyramid, there are three things that hold people back, which is one is their ability to prove their existence in the supply chain. Number two, their ability to prove their education in the supply chain. And when I say education, a recycler doesn't have to have a certificate that says that he's a recycler, but the fact that the recycler can say, hey, look, I pick up bottles that make it to A, B, and Bev, and I can prove my existence, and I'm a good recycler, that's a certified education for me, right? So that's kind of an important element. And then the third one is to break the cycle of poverty, you need the supply chain information, this education in a way that allows you leverage. And when I say leverage, we call it the economic passport. And the easiest example I'll give you is when I came to the United States, I had $240. I came legally. At the end of the month, I had a rent receipt, I had a pay stub, and I had a utility bill. I was able to take those three pieces of paper, take my education information, and I was able to get a bank account. Yet in today's world, if you look at a refugee who is now forced to move from their country, even though they were educated and come to a new country or refugee camp, if they cannot prove their education, if they cannot prove their work history, then they're just a number, right? We have millions, like 70 million refugees in the world or more now with COVID, who are in camps, who have been educated, but cannot prove their education. So what we have done now in places like Costa Rica or Zambia and Colombia and other places, we've taken this approach that refugees displaced can prove their existence in the supply chain, can prove their education in a way that gives them this economic passport. The network do? I look at it both ways, right? What can I do for the network, and what can I get from the network, right? So in my humble opinion, what I can give to the Refugee Migration Network is that there are so many opportunities that are missed every day because we take a view of refugees or the displaced as they are numbers, not equally participating in global value chains, right? So that's something that we can bring to the table today. And I'll give you a good example, right? When the COVID lockdown started, we started working with the Islamic Development Bank, and they rolled us out in 25 countries to make sure that from Sudan to Yemen to Mali, that when the masks are supposed to get to a family, they do get to the family, right? So that's a massive learning for us, but we have succeeded, right? So that's something that we can share with the network, that there's a different way of creating equity for those who've been displaced. Yeah. What I'm hoping to get from the network is the learning experience, specifically in terms of education, specifically in terms of what are the economic doors that this network is opening that we can learn from for the migrant workers or the refugees. I would say there are three fears that keep me up at night a lot. And the first fear is the inequitable distribution of the COVID vaccine when it's available. And the refugees and the migrant workers or the poorest are going to be the worst affected, because in normal circumstances, we couldn't guarantee that our donor funding got to the refugees, right? It's just a fact. Mm-hmm. So now think about that and say, how do you actually know if I gave you a $30 million grant, can you guarantee that the mother in the refugee camp in Dadaab actually got the vaccination and she has a copy of that? So that's one big fear I have, because everybody is saying, hey, equitable vaccination, but I'm like, how, right? So that's number one fear. Number two is that 100 million new people have been pushed into extreme poverty. A lot of them are refugees, right? Like it or not, right? You've become a refugee and you weren't 6 months ago, right? And then number three is child labor, right? And if you see, just alone in West Africa, 2 million new children were pushed into child labor in the cacao industry. And so they are refugees, right? I mean, if you've got pulled out of school and now you're working in a mine pulling cobalt for your smartphone or growing cacao, that's forced labor, which is pretty much being a refugee. So that's kind of what is really, really worrying, because we, again, this is just my humble opinion, right? And given my roots, is that we've become navel gazers, right? We've been driven by kind of doing this, right? On the hope side, right? I think I would counter those three things and say, we are hopeful, just because we live it every day, that there is a way to ensure that the mother got the vaccine using technologies like blockchain. There is massive amount of hope to reduce child labor by ensuring that the students are in class, right? Because otherwise, how are you going to know? We do this for Japan Tobacco, where we have now 4 countries use our software to ensure that the child is in class. And third, which is probably the most important, which is the big bucket, right? The 100 million people in extreme poverty. So gender inequality, massive amount of refugees, is to get companies to recognize that their supply chains are critical now more than ever in terms of equitability, right? Because otherwise, if you say, hey, I need to protect my P&L, and you really are not going to care about your supply chain, that 100 million could become 200 million on top of the billion people who already live in extreme poverty. So my hope is getting brands to recognize that at the end of your cup of coffee or your t-shirt, or your plastic yogurt cup is a refugee or a poor farmer or a poor waste picker.